Have you ever wondered what dark secrets lie hidden beneath the polished veneers of seemingly respectable families? What desperate measures people might take when faced with financial ruin or the fear of losing their social standing? The case I'm about to share with you today will make you question everything you thought you knew about marriage, identity, and the lengths to which some will go to preserve their legacy. This isn't just a story from the past. It's a warning about the darkness that may still lurk in the shadows of our most trusted institutions. Before I continue with this disturbing tale, please take a moment to comment where you're from. Your support is crucial as we continue to uncover and share these hidden historical cases that powerful interests have tried to bury. Subscribe to help us continue exposing these dark truths that have been concealed for far too long. In the spring of 1894, the small town of Willow Creek, Texas, was shaken to its core by a discovery that would haunt its residents for generations to come. What began as a simple investigation into a missing persons case eventually unraveled into one of the most disturbing instances of deception and manipulation the state had ever witnessed. The case centered around the prominent Blackwood family, whose sprawling cotton plantation had made them one of the wealthiest families in the county. For decades, they had maintained an image of Southern gentility and Christian virtue. Their annual Christmas ball was the highlight of the social calendar, and their charitable contributions to the local church had earned them the admiration of their neighbors. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lay a web of deceit so elaborate that it would take Detective Nathan Thorne nearly 6 months to fully uncover. I first came to Willow Creek on April 17, 1894, following reports of a young woman's disappearance, reads Thorne's official report, preserved in the Texas State Archives. Eleanor Sullivan, age 22, had vanished 3 days after her wedding to James Blackwood, the eldest son of Thomas Blackwood. What initially seemed to be a case of a bride overcome by the pressures of joining a high society family soon revealed itself to be something far more sinister. The Blackwood estate, with its imposing white columns and expansive grounds, stood like a sentinel on the outskirts of town. The property had been in the family for 3 generations, ever since William Blackwood had claimed the land in the early days of Texas statehood. From the road it appeared to be the very picture of Southern prosperity, but those who worked in the house knew of the strange sounds that sometimes echoed through the east wing at night and the rooms that remained perpetually locked. Detective Thorne's investigation began with interviews of the household staff. What he found was a culture of silence enforced through a combination of generous wages and veiled threats. "They pay us more than any other family in the county," confided Martha Jenkins, one of the kitchen maids, in her testimony. "But Mrs. Blackwood made it clear from the day I started that certain things were not to be discussed outside the house. There were rooms we weren't allowed to clean, conversations we were meant to unhear." The first breakthrough in the case came when Thorne discovered a series of letters hidden in Eleanor Sullivan's childhood home. The correspondence between Eleanor and her sister Rebecca revealed that Eleanor had harbored significant reservations about her upcoming marriage. "Dearest Rebecca," one letter dated just 2 weeks before the wedding read, "I cannot shake this feeling of dread whenever I think of my future at the Blackwood estate. James is kind enough when we're in public, but there's something in his eyes when we're alone that chills me to the bone. Yesterday, I overheard his mother referring to me as the next one when she thought I wasn't listening. What could she have meant by that? Father insists this marriage is vital for our family's financial recovery after the bank collapse, so I see no way to escape my fate. I only pray that my fears are unfounded." Sadly, Eleanor's fears would prove to be all too justified. The wedding between Eleanor Sullivan and James Blackwood took place on March 10, 1894, at the First Baptist Church of Willow Creek. By all accounts, it was a lavish affair. The guest list included the governor and several state senators, a testament to the Blackwood family's influence. Photographs from the event, now housed in the Willow Creek Historical Society, show a beaming bride and a solemn groom surrounded by their families. Nothing in these images hints at the tragedy that would soon unfold. 3 days after the wedding, Eleanor Sullivan Blackwood disappeared. According to the household staff, she had retired to her bedroom after dinner, complaining of a headache. By morning, she was gone, leaving behind all her possessions, including her wedding ring, which was found on her dressing table. Thomas Blackwood reported his daughter-in-law's disappearance to the local sheriff, expressing concern that she might have been of unstable mind. He suggested that the pressure of joining such a prestigious family had proven too much for a young woman of Eleanor's modest background. The sheriff, a longtime friend of the Blackwood family, accepted this explanation without question and made only a cursory investigation. It was Eleanor's father, George Sullivan, who refused to believe that his daughter would have abandoned her new life without a word. Despite his diminished circumstances, the bank collapse had left him nearly destitute. He scraped together enough money to hire Detective Thorne, a former Pinkerton agent, with a reputation for solving cases others couldn't. Mr. Sullivan was adamant that his daughter was not the type to run away, Thorne wrote in his notes. He described her as responsible and level-headed, not given to flights of fancy. He also mentioned that despite his financial difficulties, Eleanor had seemed reluctant about the marriage, agreeing to it primarily out of duty to her family. Thorne's investigation took a crucial turn when he began looking into the background of James Blackwood. On the surface, James appeared to be the ideal Southern gentleman, educated at Harvard, impeccably mannered, and set to inherit his family's considerable fortune. But as Thorne dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. "There's something not right about that boy," confided Harold Weber, who had taught at the local school before James was sent east for his education. He was always quiet, kept to himself, but it was more than that. Sometimes he'd say things that made no sense, refer to events he couldn't possibly have witnessed, and then there were the days when he seemed like a different person entirely, more confident, more cruel. Following this lead, Thorne traveled to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to speak with James's former classmates and professors at Harvard. What he discovered there was puzzling. While some remembered James as a brilliant but reserved student, others described him as outgoing and even aggressive, particularly toward women. One professor noted that James's academic performance had been wildly inconsistent, ranging from exceptional to barely passing, often within the same semester. "It was as if we were dealing with two different students," remarked Professor William Harrison. The James Blackwood who wrote the brilliant essay on Shakespeare's tragedies could not possibly be the same young man who could barely construct a coherent sentence the following week. The mystery deepened when Thorne obtained access to the university's attendance records. There were numerous unexplained absences throughout James's time at Harvard, sometimes lasting for weeks. Yet curiously, he had never been reprimanded for these disappearances, and his overall attendance record appeared immaculate. It was as if someone had altered the records after the fact. Meanwhile, back in Willow Creek, Thorne's assistant, Charles Miller, had been making inquiries among the town's older residents, seeking any unusual stories about the Blackwood family. One elderly woman, Esther Reynolds, who had once worked as a midwife, shared a disturbing tale. "I delivered Mrs. Blackwood's babies," she whispered, her aged hands trembling as she spoke. "Twin boys they were, born on a stormy night in 1868. But Mr. Blackwood, he only ever announced the birth of one son, James. When I asked about the other baby, Mrs. Blackwood just gave me a cold look and pressed a gold coin into my hand. There was only one child," she said. "You'd do well to remember that. I needed the money, so I kept quiet. But I've carried that secret for 26 years now, and it weighs on me still." This revelation cast the inconsistencies in James Blackwood's behavior in a new light. Could there have been two James Blackwoods all along, identical twins, one publicly acknowledged, one kept hidden away? Thorne returned to Texas immediately upon receiving this information. His next step was to examine the Blackwood family's property records, which revealed something intriguing. In 1875, Thomas Blackwood had purchased a small house on the far edge of their property, accessible only by a seldom-used road that wound through dense woodland. According to the records, this house was meant to accommodate an elderly relative, but there was no documentation of any such person ever living there. Under the cover of night, Thorne and Miller made their way to this secluded dwelling. From the outside, it appeared well-maintained but unremarkable. The windows were shuttered, and a thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone was indeed in residence. "We observed the house for 3 nights," Miller recorded in his journal. "Each evening, shortly after dusk, a figure would emerge, a young man who bore an uncanny resemblance to James Blackwood. He would walk the perimeter of a small garden before returning inside. He moved with a strange, halting gait, as if unaccustomed to open spaces. On the 3rd night, we witnessed Mrs. Blackwood arrive in a carriage. She entered the house carrying a basket covered with a cloth and departed an hour later. The next morning, we decided to approach the house directly. What they discovered inside would form the cornerstone of Thorne's case against the Blackwood family. The house was comfortably furnished, but had an institutional quality. Bars on the windows, locks on the outside of the bedroom door, and a peculiar absence of mirrors. In the main room they found a young man who was, in every physical respect, identical to James Blackwood. But his manner was entirely different, hesitant, almost childlike, with speech patterns that suggested limited contact with others. He identified himself as John, and when questioned about his family, he became agitated. "Mother says I mustn't speak of such things," he repeated. "James is the only son. James is the one who goes outside." In John's bedroom, Thorne discovered a journal filled with childish handwriting that gradually became more sophisticated over the years. The entries painted a heartbreaking picture of isolation and manipulation. "Today I practiced being James again," read one entry from 1893. "Mother says I'm getting better, but my voice still isn't right. She says soon I'll need to be perfect because James is going to bring home a wife, and sometimes he'll need to go away. Then I'll have to be him completely. I don't want to, but Mother says it's my duty to the family. She says I should have died at birth, so everything I have is because of their kindness. I owe them this." Confronted with this evidence, and fearing that Eleanor might have met with foul play, Thorne obtained a warrant to search the main Blackwood estate. In a locked room in the East Wing, they found her, alive but heavily sedated with laudanum. The room had been prepared like a hospital ward, with medical equipment and various tonics and medicines lining the shelves. Eleanor's subsequent testimony was crucial to understanding the full scope of the Blackwoods' deception. After regaining her clarity, she revealed that on her wedding night, she had noticed subtle differences in her husband's behavior. He was more hesitant, less sure of himself than the man she had reluctantly agreed to marry. "It was as if he didn't know what to do or say," she stated. "When I addressed him as James, he flinched just slightly before answering. I convinced myself it was just nerves, that marriage had somehow transformed this confident man into a nervous boy. But then, on the third night, I saw them together, James and his identical twin, talking in the garden below my window. They didn't realize I was watching. They were practicing gestures, mannerisms. The one I now know as John was mimicking James, learning how to be him. When Eleanor confronted her husband the next morning, she was met not with denial, but with cold calculation. Thomas and Victoria Blackwood explained the situation to her with disturbing frankness. The family had been concealing the existence of twins for over 26 years. John had been raised in seclusion, educated but isolated, his existence a carefully guarded secret. Only when necessary, when James needed to be in two places at once, or when he wanted to escape certain social obligations, was John brought out to play his role. "They told me I had two choices," Eleanor continued in her statement. "I could accept the situation and live as the wife to both men, alternating between them as the family dictated, or I could disappear. They made it clear that my family's financial recovery, which had been promised as part of the marriage arrangement, depended on my cooperation. When I refused, Victoria prepared the laudanum herself. The last thing I remember before waking up in that room was her voice saying, 'She'll come around.' They always do." The implication that Eleanor was not the first woman to be placed in this situation led Thorne to investigate the fates of other young women connected to the Blackwood family. He discovered that James had been briefly engaged on 3 previous occasions. Each time the engagement had ended abruptly, with the woman in question either leaving town suddenly or, in one case, reportedly dying of fever. Josephine Carter, James's fiancée in 1890, had supposedly moved to San Francisco after breaking off their engagement. Thorne's telegrams to the San Francisco police revealed no record of her ever arriving there. Mary Edwards, who had been engaged to James in 1892, had allegedly died of typhoid fever. However, the doctor who signed her death certificate had received a substantial donation from the Blackwood family that same month, raising questions about the true cause of her death. Most disturbing of all was the case of Catherine Ross, who had been engaged to James briefly in 1893. According to town gossip, Catherine had broken off the engagement and moved to New Orleans to live with an aunt. But when Thorne contacted Catherine's family in Houston, they claimed they hadn't heard from her since she visited the Blackwood estate just before the engagement was announced publicly. They had received letters supposedly from Catherine, posted from New Orleans, but the handwriting didn't match their daughter's. "We've been trying to find her for months," Catherine's father told Thorne. "The Blackwoods said she'd left a note explaining her decision to end the engagement, but they never showed it to us. They suggested she might have been embarrassed, might have needed time away from everyone who knew her. We wanted to believe them. They're such a respected family." Armed with this mounting evidence, Thorne presented his findings to Judge Samuel Wilson, who issued warrants for the arrest of Thomas, Victoria, and James Blackwood on charges of kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge also ordered a thorough search of the Blackwood property, including the grounds. It was during this search that the full horror of the Blackwoods' crimes was revealed. Behind the family mausoleum, in an area overgrown with weeds and brambles, investigators discovered 3 unmarked graves. Exhumation revealed the bodies of Josephine Carter, Mary Edwards, and Catherine Ross, each bearing signs of violent death that had been concealed through careful burial. The forensic examination suggests that these young women were killed by strangulation, wrote Dr. Frederick Lambert, the county medical examiner. In all 3 cases, there are defensive wounds on the hands and forearms, indicating that they fought against their attacker. Based on the decomposition, the times of death align with the periods when each woman supposedly left Willow Creek or, in Miss Edwards' case, succumbed to disease. As the case against the Blackwoods progressed, more details emerged about the family's elaborate deception. Victoria Blackwood, who came from a family with a history of mental instability, had apparently conceived the plan to hide one of her twin sons from the world. Thomas, concerned about dividing the family fortune and possibly influenced by his wife's increasing paranoia, had agreed. John was raised in isolation, taught to read and write by his mother, but kept entirely separate from society. His only purpose was to occasionally substitute for his brother when convenient. According to household staff who finally felt free to speak, the switches occurred several times a year, never for more than a few days at a time. James would ostensibly leave on business trips, but would actually remain hidden on the property while John took his place in public. "I knew something wasn't right," confessed Margaret Turner, a long-time cook at the Blackwood estate. "Sometimes Mr. James would come down for breakfast and not remember what he'd asked me to prepare for dinner the night before. Or he'd be kind to the scullery maid one day and act like he barely knew her name the next. But you don't question the people who pay your wages, especially not a family as powerful as the Blackwoods." The trial of the Blackwood family became a national sensation. Newspapers from as far away as New York and Chicago sent reporters to cover the case. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, eager to glimpse the family whose respectable veneer had hidden such depravity. Thomas and Victoria Blackwood maintained their innocence throughout, insisting that they had only been protecting their son, John, who they claimed was mentally deficient and needed to be kept away from a society that wouldn't understand him. James, however, eventually confessed to the murders of his former fiancées, though he attempted to portray them as crimes of passion rather than premeditated killings. "They discovered the truth, just as Eleanor did," he testified, his voice devoid of emotion. "But unlike her, they threatened to expose us immediately. I couldn't allow that to happen. Everything I've worked for, everything my family has built over generations, it would all have been destroyed by scandal." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts for all 3 Blackwoods. Thomas and Victoria were sentenced to life imprisonment for their roles in the conspiracy and cover-up. James was sentenced to death for the murders of Josephine Carter, Mary Edwards, and Catherine Ross. John Blackwood, deemed not responsible for his actions due to a lifetime of manipulation and isolation, was committed to the State Psychiatric Hospital in Austin. Eleanor Sullivan was finally able to have her marriage annulled and return to her family, though the ordeal left her permanently wary of social interactions. She would later become an advocate for women's rights, using her experience to argue for greater legal protections for wives. The Blackwood case led to significant reforms in Texas's marriage laws, with new provisions allowing women greater ease in obtaining annulments or divorces in cases of fraud or coercion. It also sparked a broader conversation about the power of wealthy families to conceal crimes and the responsibility of communities to question suspicious circumstances rather than accepting convenient explanations. Yet, despite the public nature of the trial and its outcomes, certain aspects of the case remained shrouded in mystery. Several pages were discovered to be missing from Victoria Blackwood's personal diary when it was seized as evidence. The Blackwood family's banker committed suicide the day after testifying, leaving a note that referred cryptically to other arrangements that would never come to light. Most puzzling of all was the statement of Dr. Howard Phillips, who had attended Victoria during her pregnancy and delivery. Before he could testify at the trial, he suffered a stroke that left him unable to speak. The written statement he had prepared was later found to have been removed from the court clerk's office. The only copy that remained, discovered among Phillips's personal effects after his death, contained a disturbing addendum. I must clarify that while I did indeed deliver twin boys to Victoria Blackwood that night, there is more to the story that I have never revealed. The circumstances were such that I feared for my own safety should the truth become known. Even now, as I commit these words to paper, I am aware that doing so may place me in grave danger. Nevertheless, I can no longer in good conscience maintain this silence. The rest of the page had been torn away, leaving the nature of this additional information forever unknown. In the years following the trial, the Blackwood estate fell into disrepair. The house was sold to cover legal costs and reparations to the families of the murdered women, but subsequent owners reported strange occurrences: lights that turned on and off by themselves, doors that unlocked mysteriously, and the sound of two identical voices engaged in muted conversation. The house burned to the ground in 1910, the cause of the fire never determined. The land remained vacant, with local residents considering it cursed. Even today, the area is known locally as Devil's Acre, and parents warn their children to stay away, especially after dark. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case emerged decades later, when a researcher examining census records from 1870 through 1900 discovered something odd. In the 1890 census, a property neighboring the Blackwood estate was listed as being occupied by a family called the Winstons, a husband, wife, and their twin sons. The property in question had never existed according to county records, and no trace of a Winston family could be found in any other documentation from the period. When the researcher traveled to Willow Creek to investigate this discrepancy, she was shown a family photograph from the Willow Creek Historical Society's archives. The picture, dated 1889, showed a harvest festival gathering with dozens of local families in attendance. In the back row stood a man and woman identified as Mr. and Mrs. Winston. Their sons, who appeared to be in their early 20s, stood on either side of them. The researcher later wrote, "The resemblance was unmistakable and chilling. The Winston twins could have been brothers to James and John Blackwood. Same height, same build, same distinctive shape of the jaw." It raised a disturbing question. Were the Blackwoods the only family in Willow Creek practicing this grotesque deception, or had they learned it from others? This question has never been definitively answered. Records from that period in Willow Creek's history are incomplete, many having been destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1926. Some have suggested that the photograph was a hoax, created after the fact to capitalize on the notoriety of the Blackwood case. Others believe it points to a wider conspiracy that may have involved multiple prominent families in the region. What is certain is that after the Blackwood case, 4 other wealthy families in Texas and Louisiana abruptly left their homes, liquidating their assets and disappearing without explanation. None were ever proven to have any connection to the Blackwoods, but the timing of their departures, all within 6 months of the trial's conclusion, has fueled speculation for over a century. The last living person with a direct connection to the case was Eleanor Sullivan, who died in 1962 at the age of 90. In her final interview, given to a graduate student researching historic crimes against women, she made a statement that continues to haunt those who study the case. "You're asking the wrong question," she said, her voice thin but clear despite her advanced age. "Everyone wants to know how the Blackwoods could have done such a thing, how they could have maintained such a deception for so long. The real question is, how many others were doing the same? How many young women, before and since, have looked into their husband's eyes and sensed something wrong, some fundamental inconsistency that they couldn't quite name? How many have been gaslighted into believing they were imagining things when their intuition was screaming that the man before them was somehow not the same man they had agreed to marry?" Detective Thorne's investigation didn't end with the Blackwood trial. The case haunted him long after the gavel fell, compelling him to search for answers to the questions that remained. In his personal journal, discovered after his death in 1920, he wrote, I cannot escape the feeling that we only scratch the surface of something far more pervasive and sinister. The missing diary pages, the banker's suicide, Dr. Phillips's incomplete statement, all point to a conspiracy beyond the Blackwood family itself. His suspicions were reinforced when he attempted to trace Victoria Blackwood's family history. The Harrington family of Boston, from which Victoria claimed descent, had no record of a daughter named Victoria, born in the appropriate year. When Thorne traveled to Boston in 1895, he found that the family graves in the cemetery where Victoria's parents were supposedly buried belonged to a different Harrington family entirely, one with no connection to the woman who became Mrs. Blackwood. It appears that Victoria Blackwood fabricated her entire background, Thorne noted, but for what purpose? And how did she manage to infiltrate Texas high society with a false identity? Someone must have vouched for her, introduced her into those circles, someone powerful enough that their word was never questioned. Thorne's investigation led him to an obscure religious sect that had operated in Massachusetts in the mid-19th century. The Brotherhood of the Sacred Twin, as they called themselves, believed that twins represented divine duality, one soul split between two bodies. According to their doctrine, this division was a sacred trust, allowing the soul to experience two separate lives simultaneously. More disturbingly, the Brotherhood taught that if one twin could learn to perfectly imitate the other, they could achieve a kind of immortality, with one continuing the life of the other after death. The sect had been officially disbanded in 1855, following allegations of child endangerment and ritualistic abuse, but Thorne discovered evidence suggesting that some adherents had relocated to the South, particularly to isolated communities in Texas and Louisiana. I believe Victoria may have been raised in this tradition, Thorne wrote. It would explain her fixation on concealing one of her twins, on training John to substitute for James. But if this is true, it raises the possibility that the practice didn't originate with her, that she was carrying on a tradition passed down to her, perhaps through generations. Meanwhile, Eleanor Sullivan's return to society wasn't without incident. In the months following the trial, she reported being followed by strangers on several occasions. Anonymous letters arrived at her father's modest home, containing cryptic warnings, "Some secrets should remain buried," and "Not all twins are known." Most chilling was an encounter she described in a letter to Detective Thorne in 1896. "Yesterday, while shopping in Houston, I came face to face with a woman who could have been Victoria Blackwood's sister, so striking was the resemblance. She smiled at me in a way that froze my blood, then leaned close and whispered, 'How can you be certain which one you married?' Before I could respond, she disappeared into the crowd. I've been unable to sleep since, tormented by the possibility that there might be others like the Blackwoods hiding in plain sight." Thorne took these concerns seriously enough to arrange for protection for Eleanor, but the incidents gradually subsided. Whether this was because the threat had passed or because those responsible had simply become more cautious remains unclear. John Blackwood's fate at the state psychiatric hospital added another layer to the mystery. Hospital records indicate that he was a model patient, quiet and cooperative. He received weekly visits from a woman who identified herself as his cousin, though no Blackwood cousins were documented in the family records Thorne had compiled. These visits continued for nearly a year, until John disappeared from the hospital on November 12, 1895. The official report stated that he had somehow obtained a key to his room and simply walked out during a shift change. No trace of him was ever found, despite an extensive search. The timing of his disappearance, exactly one day before James Blackwood's scheduled execution, raised questions that were never satisfactorily answered. James Blackwood went to the gallows maintaining that his parents had acted out of love for their damaged son. His final statement, recorded by the prison chaplain, contained a puzzling assertion: "What we did because we had to. The alternative was unthinkable. One day, perhaps, the world will understand that some traditions must be preserved, no matter the cost. The Blackwood legacy will continue, though you believe it ends with me today." The execution proceeded as scheduled, but rumors persisted for years that it was John, not James, who had been hanged, a final substitution to save the favored son. These rumors were impossible to verify, as the body was claimed by a distant relative and quickly cremated, against the usual custom of the time. Victoria Blackwood died in prison in 1902, taking whatever secrets remained with her to the grave. Thomas Blackwood survived until 1911, but suffered a stroke in 1903 that left him unable to communicate. Whether he might have eventually revealed more about the family's practices will never be known. The case might have gradually faded from memory, if not for a series of eerily similar incidents that occurred in the decades following. In 1912, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell disappeared 3 weeks after her marriage to Edward Coleman, heir to a lumber fortune in East Texas. Her family received letters supposedly written by her, claiming she had run away to start a new life in California. But handwriting experts later determined the letters were forgeries. In 1927, Amelia Harrison vanished shortly after becoming engaged to William Porter, a banker's son from a prominent Houston family. When police investigated, they discovered that Porter had a twin brother who had supposedly died in childhood. No death certificate was ever found, and neighbors reported occasionally seeing two identical young men entering the Porter home late at night. Most recently, in 1969, journalist Rebecca Martinez was investigating these historical disappearances for a book when her research took her to a small town in Louisiana. She never returned from the trip. Her notes, recovered from her abandoned car, contained multiple references to twin substitution and marriage deception, along with the cryptic phrase, "It's still happening, they're still here." Whether these cases are connected to the Blackwood case or are simply copycat incidents inspired by the notorious trial is impossible to determine. What is certain is that the practice of concealing the existence of twins and using them as substitutes for one another has occurred multiple times throughout American history, often with tragic consequences for the women who became entangled in these families. Some scholars have suggested that the practice may have economic roots, a way to ensure that family fortunes remained undivided while still providing for two heirs. Others see it as a manifestation of control, with powerful families seeking to manipulate even the most fundamental aspects of identity. Psychological studies of identical twins separated at birth have consistently shown that despite their identical genetic makeup, twins develop distinct personalities, preferences, and mannerisms. The idea that one twin could perfectly substitute for another over extended periods requires not just physical resemblance, but a systematic suppression of individual identity, a form of psychological torture inflicted from the earliest age. The Blackwood case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about identity, autonomy, and the nature of family bonds. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest horrors aren't supernatural but entirely human, born of greed, ambition, and a willingness to sacrifice others for one's own purposes. For the women who married into these families, the horror was particularly acute. To discover that the person sharing your life, your home, your bed, was sometimes a stranger, an imposter playing a role, represents a violation of trust so profound that many victims never fully recovered. Eleanor Sullivan was one of the fortunate ones, saved before the deception could continue indefinitely. Others were not so lucky. "The true horror of my experience," Eleanor wrote in her memoirs, published in 1930, "was not the fear for my physical safety, though that was certainly real. It was the realization that every moment of intimacy, every private conversation, every vulnerability I had shown to the man I believed was my husband might have been witnessed by an impostor. The sanctity of marriage was not merely damaged, but utterly destroyed by this deception. In its place was a grotesque performance, a mockery of the bond I thought I had formed. The Blackwood case serves as a warning about the facades we accept without question and the secrets that may lurk behind them. It reminds us to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, to question inconsistencies rather than dismissing them. Most importantly, it demonstrates that the most convincing monsters are those who walk among us wearing human faces, their monstrosity concealed behind social standing and respectable appearances. Today, the former Blackwood property remains undeveloped, an overgrown patch of land that locals still avoid. The foundations of the house can still be made out among the weeds, and the family cemetery, where generations of Blackwoods were buried before the scandal, stands neglected, its stones weathered and tilting. Occasionally, visitors to the area report seeing two identical young men walking the perimeter of the property at dusk. They appear to be in their 20s, dressed in clothing from another era, their faces solemn as they trace and retrace the boundaries of what was once their home. These sightings are most common on March 10th, the anniversary of Eleanor's wedding to James Blackwood, and November 12th, the date of John's disappearance from the asylum. Local paranormal investigators have attempted to document these apparitions numerous times, but cameras invariably malfunction when directed at the property. Audio recordings capture nothing but static, occasionally broken by what sounds like two voices speaking in unison, though the words are never clear enough to be deciphered. Whether these phenomena represent actual hauntings or simply the power of suggestion working on visitors familiar with the site's dark history is a matter of debate. What isn't debatable is the lasting impact of the case on the collective psyche of Willow Creek and the wider world. The Blackwood case reminds us that evil often hides in plain sight, that the most respected members of a community may harbor the darkest secrets. It warns us that appearances can be deceptive, that even those closest to us may not be who they appear to be. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is not what we know, but what remains unknown. How many other families practiced similar deceptions? How many other women found themselves unwitting pawns in these elaborate games of identity and inheritance? How many other twins were raised in isolation, their very existence denied, their identities subordinated to their siblings? These questions have no definitive answers, but they continue to haunt us, much as the spirits of James and John Blackwood are said to haunt the land where they once lived. They remind us to look beneath the surface, to question what we think we know, and to remember that sometimes the truth is more terrifying than any ghost story. As you go about your day, interacting with friends, family, colleagues, and strangers, ask yourself this: how well do you really know the people in your life? Could someone close to you be hiding a secret as profound as a hidden identity? The Blackwood case teaches us that such deceptions are not merely possible, but have actually occurred throughout history. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the vast majority of people are exactly who they appear to be, but perhaps keep one eye open, just in case. And if you ever meet identical twins, pay close attention to which is which. Your life might someday depend on it. For those of you who found this story disturbing, remember that the light of truth is our best protection against the darkness of deception. Turn to faith for comfort in these troubling times. As Psalm 23 reminds us, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone if we open our hearts to God's presence.